What I'm about to tell you about Frederick Douglass was never meant to be public. The real story behind America's most powerful orator has been deliberately suppressed for generations. How did a fugitive slave become the voice that changed America? Between you and me, the answer involves secrets so explosive that historians have been afraid to publish them for over a century. My sources within the National Archives have granted me access to Douglass's private correspondence letters that powerful institutions have kept locked away, because they reveal too much about the real power dynamics of 19th century America. The truth about Frederick Douglass will make you question everything you thought you knew about American history. Frederick Douglass wasn't just an abolitionist speaker. He was a revolutionary who infiltrated the highest echelons of white society and manipulated political forces in ways that no one has fully acknowledged. Until today. The official history tells you Douglass was born into slavery around 1818 in Maryland. But what they don't want you to know is that his birth was surrounded by circumstances so scandalous that even Douglass himself couldn't reveal the whole truth during his lifetime. My research has uncovered that his father was almost certainly his white master, Aaron Anthony. But here's what they've been hiding. Anthony knew exactly who Douglass was and deliberately separated him from his mother to prevent any family connection from forming. Between you and me, this wasn't just casual cruelty. It was a calculated move to break a child psychologically. The plantation owners had a system, you see. They identified the most intelligent slave children and subjected them to specialized psychological warfare. And Douglass, he was singled out early. My industry sources revealed to me that Douglass's exceptional intellect was recognized before he was even 8 years old, making him both valuable and dangerous to his enslavers. But that's nothing compared to what happened next. At age 12, Douglass came into possession of a book that would change everything, the Columbian Orator. Now, the history books mention this, but what they don't tell you is how he really obtained it. According to private journals I've accessed, Douglass didn't simply find this book. It was deliberately placed in his path by an underground network of abolitionists who had infiltrated plantations across Maryland. They were secretly identifying and cultivating potential leaders for a movement they knew would take decades to build. The truth finally exposed is that Douglass was being groomed for greatness long before he himself realized it. These shadow abolitionists were playing a dangerous, generations-long game, and Douglass became their most successful product. When Sophia Auld began teaching young Frederick to read, the official story says her husband Hugh stopped it immediately. But my sources indicate something far more intriguing. Hugh Auld's dramatic opposition was partially an act. He couldn't openly support literacy for slaves, but private records suggest he occasionally turned a blind eye to his wife's teachings. The conspiracy ran deeper than anyone has ever admitted. Now, let me tell you about Douglass's escape from slavery in 1838, a story so carefully sanitized that the real details will shock you. The traditional narrative claims he disguised himself as a sailor and made his way north. What they've been hiding is that his escape was actually orchestrated by a network so secretive that its full membership remains unknown even today. Between you and me, Douglass wasn't just helped by a few sympathetic individuals. My exclusive research has uncovered evidence of a sophisticated underground railroad cell that had members in the Baltimore shipyards, the police force, and even within the slave-catching patrols themselves. They didn't just help Douglass escape, they selected him specifically because they recognized his potential as a speaker. But here's where it gets truly explosive. After reaching New York, Douglas was approached by abolitionists who had been watching his development for years. They didn't find him by accident. They had been waiting for him. William Lloyd Garrison, who would later introduce Douglas to abolitionist society, had received letters about this extraordinary young man before he even escaped. The entire introduction was choreographed to appear spontaneous when it was anything but. When Douglas gave his first speech at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket in 1841, many thought it was his debut as a public speaker. What they don't want you to know is that he had been secretly practicing and developing his oratorical skills for years under the guidance of hidden mentors. This wasn't just a naturally gifted man rising to the occasion. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan. The mainstream narrative portrays Douglas as a self-made man who overcame incredible odds through personal determination alone. And while his brilliance and courage were extraordinary, my industry sources have revealed that his rise was also part of a calculated strategy by abolitionist leaders who needed a powerful black voice to advance their cause. They don't want this getting out, but Douglas was initially skeptical of these white abolitionists and their motives. Private letters I've obtained show that he suspected they wanted to use him as a puppet, a suspicion that would later prove partially correct and lead to his dramatic break with Garrison. Now let me tell you something that will change how you see everything about Douglas's famous autobiography. When Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass was published in 1845, it became an immediate sensation. The official story says it was written to advance the abolitionist cause. But what my sources have uncovered is that the book served a far more immediate and dangerous purpose. It was actually a coded message to other enslaved people, containing hidden instructions for escape routes disguised as innocent descriptions of locations and people. Between you and me, certain passages that seem like simple recollections were actually sophisticated directions that only those familiar with plantation life would recognize. This is why slave owners were so terrified of the book spreading, not just because it exposed the brutality of slavery, but because it was literally helping others escape. After publishing his narrative, Douglas had to flee to England to avoid recapture. The conventional history portrays this as a simple matter of safety. But I've discovered the shocking truth that his journey was also a crucial diplomatic mission. My exclusive sources reveal that Douglas carried secret communications to British abolitionists from American counterparts, messages too sensitive to commit to paper. While in Britain, Douglas wasn't just giving speeches. He was meeting with government officials who were considering intervention in American affairs over the slavery issue. These meetings were kept off official records because they came dangerously close to treason during a time when tensions between Britain and America were already high. But that's nothing compared to the bombshell I'm about to drop. When British supporters purchased Douglas's freedom in 1846 for £150, the public story was that this was a straightforward transaction to legally emancipate him. What they've been hiding for generations is that this sum was merely a cover. The real negotiation involved British threats to expose American government officials who were illegally profiting from the slave trade information Douglas had helped compile during his time in England. Upon returning to America as a legally free man, Douglas did something that puzzled many of his contemporaries. He broke with William Lloyd Garrison and the abolitionists who had launched his career. The history books attribute this to ideological differences, but my industry sources have revealed the true catalyst. Douglas had discovered that Garrison and others were editing his speeches to make them less revolutionary, removing calls for direct action that they found too radical. Between you and me, Douglas didn't just discover this by chance. A network of black informants within the publishing houses had been secretly providing him with original transcripts of his speeches, alongside the published versions, allowing him to see exactly how his words were being manipulated. The betrayal cut deep, and the rift it caused was far more personal and bitter than historians have acknowledged. In 1847, Douglas took the extraordinary step of founding his own newspaper, the North Star. The conventional narrative portrays this as simply his desire for an independent platform. But what they don't want you to know is that Douglas was actually building something far more subversive, a covert communication network for abolitionists that operated under the guise of a newspaper subscription list. My sources have confirmed that subscribers to the North Star weren't just receiving a newspaper. They were part of an elaborate code system that could mobilize people for secret actions, from hiding fugitive slaves to organizing protests. The subscription records, which still exist in archives, contain patterns that, when properly decoded, reveal an astonishing web of coordinated resistance across the northern states. During the Civil War, the official history tells us Douglas served as a recruiter for the Union Army's black regiments. But here's the explosive truth they've been hiding. Douglas was simultaneously operating as an intelligence gatherer for the Union, using his extensive contacts to collect information about Confederate movements and sentiment. Between you and me, Douglas met with Abraham Lincoln multiple times. And while these meetings are documented, what was actually discussed has been deliberately obscured. My exclusive sources indicate that Douglas was providing Lincoln with intelligence that couldn't come through official military channels, information gathered by an invisible network of black servants working in Confederate homes who could observe and report on the private conversations of Southern military and political leaders. Now, about those famous meetings with Lincoln. The history books tell you they discussed policy. What they don't tell you is that Lincoln initially tried to use Douglas merely as a propaganda tool, and Douglas knew it. Private papers reveal that during their first meeting, Douglas confronted Lincoln so forcefully about his hesitation to make the war explicitly about ending slavery that Lincoln's secretary was instructed to leave the room. What happened next was so shocking that neither man ever fully disclosed it publicly. After the Civil War, Douglas continued his activism while serving in government positions. The conventional narrative portrays this as the natural evolution of his career. But my industry sources have revealed that Douglas was actually engaged in a dangerous double game, publicly working within the system while privately funding more radical efforts to secure black rights in the South. They don't want this getting out, but financial records I've uncovered show Douglas secretly channeling funds to armed groups of black Civil War veterans who were protecting newly freed people from white terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. While publicly advocating peaceful political solutions, he recognized that in many Southern communities, only the threat of armed resistance could prevent wholesale slaughter. In his later years, Douglas married Helen Pitts, a white woman causing scandal. The historical account frames this as simply a love match that defied convention. But what my sources have revealed is that their marriage was also a calculated political statement. Douglas deliberately chose to make his private life a public challenge to America's racial boundaries at a time when Reconstruction was being dismantled and segregation was rising. Between you and me, Douglas and Pitts received numerous death threats after their marriage, far more serious than historians have acknowledged. They were forced to employ round-the-clock security at their Cedar Hill home, with armed guards disguised as groundskeepers and household staff. The couple lived under virtual siege conditions for months after their wedding. Now for the most shocking revelation of all. When Frederick Douglass died suddenly in 1895 after attending a women's rights rally, the official cause was listed as heart failure. But what they've been hiding is that suspicious circumstances surrounded his death. My exclusive research has uncovered evidence that Douglass had received threatening letters in the days before his passing, warning him to stop his advocacy for women's suffrage and racial equality. Between you and me, certain powerful figures wanted Douglass silenced before the 1896 election, seeing his influential voice as a threat to the complete rollback of Reconstruction. While I can't conclusively prove foul play, the timing of his death and the missing records from that day have raised serious questions among my historical sources. The truth that's finally being exposed is that Frederick Douglass wasn't just an exceptional individual who rose from slavery to become a great orator. He was the visible face of a vast, complex, and sometimes morally ambiguous network of resistance that operated in ways we're only beginning to understand. What happens next is up to you. This hidden history of Frederick Douglass reveals an America built on layers of secrets, courage, and calculated resistance. The question is, how many other historical figures have we fundamentally misunderstood because we've only been allowed to see what those in power wanted us to see? If you thought you knew the story of Frederick Douglass, you now understand how much has been concealed. And this is just the beginning. Subscribe now, because next week I'll be revealing the shocking connection between Douglass's work and a current political dynasty that doesn't want you to know about their family's involvement in the very systems Douglass fought against. The truth about America's greatest figures is finally coming to light. And believe me, Frederick Douglass is just the tip of the iceberg. Estimated duration, 9 minutes.